makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Newsflash, young people hate capitalism. Who would have thought? In line with a lot of recent polls that show that young people are drawn increasingly towards socialism and are increasingly skeptical about the benefits of capitalism, the Institute of Economic Affairs produced a recent report and did a survey showing that 67% of young Brits want a socialist economic system. Now, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a right-wing think tank, basically a Thatcherite pro-market think tank, and like most right-wing think tanks, they're mostly like a lobbying firm than anything else, more lobbying than they do thinking. But it has some interesting stuff in it, so let's review the results. So this was a poll conducted in 2,000 people, aged 16 to 34, earlier this year. And 67% say they would like to live in a socialist economic system. 75% agree with the assertion that climate change is a specifically capitalist problem. I partly disagree with this because, for starters, the USSR and other communist countries had a terrible record on the environment. And if you look at the world's most polluting firms, a lot of them are actually state-owned energy firms. So state-owned oil firms, for example. If you saw the recent video of the Gulf of Mexico in flames, that was actually Pemex, Mexico's state-owned oil firm. And I should add, Mexico's supposedly left-wing government is very much a proponent of more oil and less environment. So, yeah. However, I do think that our inability to deal with climate change is definitely a capitalist issue. Why? Because liberal, democratic, capitalist societies struggle to be able to do anything against heavy lobbying by these energy companies. They fail to contain the influence of basically very rich people, very large corporations. And it's much harder, I would think, for a capitalist country to face the pressure of all these economic interests and do something about climate change than it would if there was a socialist government that realized, hey, climate change is a problem, we need to deal with it. They would probably be much better suited to dealing with it. So I think the problem with countries like the USSR is that they just didn't care about about climate change back then. And fair enough, back in the 70s and 80s, we weren't as obsessed with the environment as we are now. So, yeah, I partly disagree with it, but I mostly agree with it. 78% blame capitalism for Britain's housing crisis. I mean, this is 100% true. There is no way you can argue that Britain's housing crisis is not due to just leaving what is essentially a social good, housing, entirely to the whims of the market, entirely to the whims of developers, which in Britain are basically a cartel. There's not a free market really in developing houses. Things like letting rich people from China, Malaysia, Russia, etc. to buy a property in London instead of prioritizing Londoners. Yeah, all of this is basically a housing market left entirely to the whims of the market, and the government failing to build housing as they used to do back in the day, back in the pre-Thatcher era. 72% support the renationalization of various industries such as energy, water, and the railways. If you've lived in Britain, you would, like most people, agree that the railways should probably be nationalized. Britain's experiment in privatized railways is an utter disaster. If you've visited continental Europe and compare the quality of trains and the price of trains in the continent relative to Britain, it's a whole different world. I mean, you can get a train ticket in for like a similar distance in a much better train for half the cost in France or Germany or Spain or whatever. Like, they all have so much better trains than Britain does, and even faster trains. So there's no high-speed rail at all in Britain. So yeah. As for utilities, I think there is definitely the case that the state should have some role in these markets. So either have a state-owned energy or water company that essentially, the existence of a state-owned firm in a market like this keeps prices down, because the private providers need to compete with the state-owned provider. So at the very least, yes, there should be some state involvement in these markets. If they were fully nationalized, I personally wouldn't complain. I consider myself a market socialist in the sense that I basically believe in worker-owned firms, but in terms of utilities, in terms of social services, etc., yes, I do think that that's where the state should actively participate. So yeah, I would say that this is all true. 72% that private sector involvement would put the NHS at risk. I think the experience in Britain of privatizing the NHS by stealth, which has basically been the strategy of this Tory government over the past years, over the past decade, is harmful for the NHS, because you either have a system where, so for example, in Europe, a lot of the healthcare providers are private. So for example, in France, hospitals are private. What you have is a national health insurance paid by the state, which means that you get your healthcare for free. So if you transition to a system like that, yeah, fine, because the UK is actually a rarity in the sense that it is a giant monolithic organization. The NHS is I think the largest employer in Europe. And it's the sole provider. So this has benefits, but it also has some drawbacks. So the healthcare in Britain is actually one of the cheapest in the world for a Western developed country, which is a good thing. In terms of outcomes, it's not the best one. So you have healthcare sectors in Europe that do much better in terms of outcomes than Britain does. So there's some pros and there's some cons. But what the government is doing with the NHS, as in they're not really changing the healthcare model, but instead what they're doing is just privatizing the NHS bit by bit without people really realizing what areas of the NHS are private. And in many respects, these areas are less accountable, less transparent than if they would be still publicly run. Yeah, I do think that that is not a good thing. 75% agree with the statement that socialism is a good idea, but it has failed in the past because it has been badly done. Yeah, this is partly true. I think this is basically the question of, the idea of socialism being the former communist bloc, that type of central planning, which failed. Yeah, it failed. It had its benefits. A lot of these countries caught up to standard, to like GDP levels that were closer to the capitalist West for a time. They industrialized, etc. But I don't think really that's the model of socialism that most young people aspire to. I think most young people see socialism in the kind of Jeremy Corbyn model or Bernie Sanders model of socialism, which really is just basically social democracy. So it's not even non-capitalist. I think it just involves strengthening the welfare state, indeed giving the state a bit more of an influence in society, constraining the more rapacious elements of free markets. I think that's the vision of socialism that most young people want. Workplace democracy, things like that. If you look at Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie's agenda, most of it was social democracy. It wasn't socialism. The only aspect of either's policy that I do think was socialist was the element of basically forcing worker ownership in major companies. And Bernie proposed 20%, Corbyn proposed 10%. That's still minor. Like, this still would leave most firms essentially shareholder owned, not worker owned. So even that one single socialist policy was very, very, very watered down. But I do think that most young people don't see the USSR as the model of socialism that they want, except for the tankies. But you all know what I think of tankies. So, yeah. Young people associate socialism predominantly with positive terms such as workers, public, equal, and fair. Very few associate it with failure, and virtually nobody associates it with Venezuela, the erstwhile showcase of 21st century socialism. So whenever you have an argument with right-wingers about capitalism and socialism, they will always bring up Venezuela. Always. 100% of the time. Like, that is their example of why socialism automatically fails. Not, for example, Bolivia, which they describe themselves as socialist. They're still primarily capitalist, but they describe themselves as socialist. I recently did a report on Bolivia's basically rural development policies, and it's actually incredible the way that they've used a very inclusive agenda. And they are entirely focused on, poverty, inequality, etc. Bolivia has been an amazing success story by any standard of the imagined. By capitalist standards, Bolivia has been an amazing success story. It's been one of the fastest growing Latin American countries, has reduced poverty, has reduced inequality, has given a lot of representation and rights to its indigenous people. It's absolutely amazing what they've done. So why isn't Bolivia an example of 21st century socialism? No, it's the failures. Venezuela, which is a failure. I don't think that socialists should shy, or leftists in general should shy away from saying that Venezuela is a failure. And let's be honest, if tomorrow the entire world became socialist, all 200 plus countries in the world became socialist, there would be plenty of failures too. There would be success stories, there would be failures, like in every other model. But what I dislike about this frequent use of Venezuela as the example of socialism failing is that if you look at the countries, so this is a list of countries by GDP per capita. If you look at the bottom part of this chart, of this table, the poorest countries on earth are all capitalist, all of them. Burundi, Malawi, Liberia, Eritrea, Togo, etc. All of these countries are capitalist. Capitalism is the main form of economic organization. They all trade with each other. Many are part of trade blocs. So why don't we consider these countries as, hey, capitalism hasn't really got them out of poverty at all. In fact, relative to the West, a lot of these countries are poorer now than they used to be back in the 70s. In fact, the only region in the world that has converged with the West since the 1970s has been East Asia. So basically, thanks to China, thanks to the tigers, etc. But every other region in the world, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, they're all poorer relative to the West now than they were in the 1970s. So, yeah, great job, capitalism. Now, the capitalist will argue, oh, but these aren't like, these are very bad examples because they're kleptocracies, they are authoritarian states, they're not really, market democracies. Like, well, the same can be said about Venezuela. If you're going to argue that these countries are not real capitalist countries because they don't fit into your vision of what capitalism is, Well, guess what? Venezuela is also not an example of what socialism should be. Most socialists, again, except for the tankies, most socialists don't want socialist countries to become authoritarian states like Venezuela. Yeah. Anyway, capitalism, meanwhile, is predominantly associated with terms such as exploitative, unfair, the rich, and corporations. Well, when the system clearly isn't working for these young people, they will use terms like this to describe it because it's true. It is exploitative. It is unfair. The people who benefit from the system are the rich and corporations, not normal people. Supporters of the market economy often dismiss support for left-wing ideas as a phase young people have always gone through, but capitalists can no longer reassure themselves that the young will grow out of it. This polling finds little difference in attitudes between millennial and Gen Z. Where it does exist, it indicates Zoomers will grow into it rather than millennials out. As Niemitz argues, he's the author of this report, none of the survey results mean that supporters of capitalism should throw in the towel, concede defeat in the battle of ideas, and just accept that the future belongs to socialism. Instead, they should take millennial socialism far more seriously than they currently do. They should treat it as a challenge and engage with it rather than dismiss it or deny it exists. Well, at least they're honest about recognizing that it's not a passing fad, which I definitely agree that it isn't. But then here's the problem. Supporters of the market economy need to accept that challenge and rise to it rather than dismiss it or pretend it is not happening. We need to get better at making the positive case for capitalism, developing market-based policy solutions to the problems young people are facing, as well as explaining why socialism, seductive though it may be, is always and everywhere a dead end. So here's the main problem. You've made the correct diagnosis, but your solution is essentially this belief that the reason that people are so skeptical about capitalism is because capitalism has a public relations problem, has a PR problem, rather than a results problem. And this is such a neoliberal way of thinking. It's basically like every company which refuses to recognize its mistakes. Their first solution is always, let's get PR, let's do some PR. This is ridiculous, like absolutely ridiculous. Like I said, this makes it seem like it's a PR problem rather than a results problem. And the problem is that when you have market-based policies that have failed, your solution should not be more market policies, like the housing crisis. You really want to resolve the housing crisis, which is essentially a market disaster, by more market disasters? This is unbelievable. This is absolutely unbelievable. The fact that they don't even cede an inch to the idea that actually, well, maybe we should involve the state a bit more. Maybe our vision, maybe British capitalism has gone a bit too far. Maybe we need to constrain it a bit more. And this was the logic of the creation of social democracy, the mixed economy. That's why it's called mixed. In the post-war era, when a lot of European countries were having a very big political challenge by their communist parties, the mixed economy was a solution to this. It was like, hey, we're going to stay capitalist, but we are going to give the state a bigger role in society. And that's how these, welfare states came into being. It was a middle road. It was an attempt to contain communism or socialism, while at the same time retaining an acceptable degree of capitalism for everyone. And in fact, the earliest welfare state, which was Germany, or rather the initial kind of welfare type system that was created, which was under Bismarck in Germany, was precisely done as a reaction to pressure from socialists. So back then, people were smart enough to realize, hey, capitalism is incredibly oppressive for a lot of people, and now socialists and communists are increasingly vocal and increasingly politically influential. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to listen to them. Even friggin' Bismarckian Germany was smart enough to realize that. Okay? This was not a democracy. Even Bismarckian Germany understood that it was better to listen to the socialists and adopt some of their policies, enough that then the system itself would not be challenged. But these idiots at the IEA don't even get that. Their solution to capitalism's problem is more capitalism, more markets. How stupid can you be? And anyway, when I say that this is a results issue, not a PR issue, I'm going to show some charts to give you an idea of why young British people are so skeptical about capitalism. So this is the real wage growth of the OECD since 2007. This was the last normal year before the Great Recession. And the UK is right here. It was 1.1. So real wage growth in the UK during this 13-year period was just 1.1%. This was not the yearly average. No. That 1.1 is for 13 years. And who are the countries that are around it? Italy, Portugal, Greece, Spain. Countries that had much more severe crises than Britain did as a result of the global financial crisis. So how is it that the UK only managed 1.1% real wage growth during this time? That's British capitalism in action. That is, the growth does not trickle down. And look at all these other countries. There's Germany. There's all these there's Sweden. All these welfare states. All these semi-socialist states. That's how bad they are, having wage growth in the double digits versus capitalist Britain, just 1.1%. Then there's the housing crisis, which at least the report admits that is part of the reason that young people are so cynical about capitalism. But again, when their solution is just more market-based policies to address this, you can tell that they're not really serious about it. So the red lines are from the Nationwide, that's a building society. They produced quarterly data on house prices relative to earnings. And then the blue lines are from the ONS, the Office of National Statistics. They only produced annual numbers. So according to Nationwide, for the entire UK, the house price relative to earnings is 5.6. That is, the average house in Britain costs 5.6 times the average income or average earnings. This compares to less than 3 back in the early 80s and just barely over 2 back in the mid-90s. So, that's an entire generation that's been screwed out of house. And if you're in London, that's 9.6. 9.6. And again, in the mid-90s, this was not even 3. So this is insane. And the ONS numbers are even worse. For the ONS for England and Wales, it's 7.7. And this hasn't been updated. So the last data from the ONS is 2020, and there's been a spike in house prices in 2021, as you can see here. So this is higher now than 7.7. And in London, 11.8. 11.8 times average earnings. That's crazy. So how can you look at these numbers and tell me British capitalism is not failing? How can you tell me that these 67% of young Britons are just suffering from a PR issue? How? I mean, this is not expected. This is not unexpected coming from the Institute of Economic Affairs, who, like I said, is basically just a pro-market right-wing think tank / lobbying firm. The only concession I give to this report is that they accept that it's not a fad. But I struggle. So again, here's the thing. They see this as a part of a battle of ideas, when in fact the burden of proof falls on the supporters of British capitalism to say, how on earth is it succeeding? How do you expect people to not be cynical about capitalism when you have situations like this? When 13 entire years have gone by and your wage is up only 1.1%. How do you argue that? And the answer is they don't. And that's why the right wing these days is avoiding economic discussions. They're avoiding economic debates. They're using their war on wokeness as an excuse to not deal with this. That's why now they're all obsessed. But if you look at any issue of The Spectator these days, it's all about wokeness. They don't want to deal with the economic arguments. And like I said, if they're just going to see this as a PR problem, I don't think they'll win. I don't think they'll win in these battle of ideas, because they don't have the results. Pure and simple. So, good that young people are increasingly cynical about a system that isn't working for them in any way, because young people will feel that it's a system that isn't working for them. They will know that they are struggling more than their parents to obtain, basic necessities such as housing. They feel powerless and alienated at work. All these factors put together are the reasons why they are more cynical about capitalism. And ironically, people like the IEA don't understand that when you do reach a certain level of affluence as a society, so a young person in Britain right now has a much more complex critique of the system than someone, say, in the 1950s. And they will be concerned about issues that perhaps people in previous generations were not concerned about as much, like inequality. And this is not because they're pampered, because you hear this from the right as well. They're these pampered middle classes or young people. No, it's not that. It's that you expect more, and you should get more. There's no reason why the system can't give you more. So they're right to complain. Anyway, we'll see if this results in any meaningful change. I doubt it. But for the most part, the kids are all right by looking at this. So, thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like, please share. More importantly, please subscribe, and there will be more good content coming soon. Thank you.